Okay, I think we are on. Good evening to everyone who is maybe logging on in Italy, and I probably should say good day to everyone who is logging on in the Western Hemisphere, including our three poets. Before I introduce everyone, I want to thank the cohort at the Siena Art Institute for organizing today's conversation and performing some of the less glamorous behind the scenes work for us. I have the pleasure of getting to talk to and listen to this fine group of poets today, a group that represents the past, present, and future of Policromia, which is the Siena Art Institute's annual festival of poetry and translation. I'm joined by my co-organizer, Mairéad Byrne, a wonderful poet in her own right, and a professor of poetry at the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence. Also with us is Dirceu Villa, who is a past participant in Policromia and is a wonderful poet and translator who's joining us from Brazil. And Dirceu's latest book, forgive me, Dirceu, if I butcher the title, is Curaçao. I think Curaçao, is that?
Curaçao, yeah.
Curaçao. Not very close. And finally joining us from Brooklyn, New York, is John Murillo, who's also a poet and the author of two collections of poetry, most recently Contemporary American Poetry. That's contemporary with a K, American with a K. And John was slated to come to Policromia in 2020, and unfortunately, for obvious reasons, we had to cancel. But we're glad to have him here with us today, and hope that we might lure him to Siena in the future, when we can all get together in Siena. So today we're going to pair off. I'm going to talk to John for about 10 minutes about poetry and the practice of poetry and its purpose. And we'll get to hear some of John's poetry. And then Mairéad and Dirceu are going to speak for 10 minutes. And we'll get to the chance to hear some of Dirceu's poems. For those of you who are listening to this, watching this live, please feel free to ask questions or leave comments in the chat. And at the end of the event, we'll try to address those. But before we pair off, we have invited our poets to speak briefly about how the events of this past year have influenced their writing, both perhaps their specific writing practice or their understanding of poetry, their thinking about poetry. I thought, if it's okay with you three, that I'd be happy to just say a very few words myself about this topic, and then we could proceed in alphabetical order. So that would be Mairéad, then John, and then Dirceu. Does that sound
Sure.
all right to you all? Great. Okay. As I said, quite briefly, and I'm hoping not to cast a shadow over the conversation tonight, I, for one, found myself having trouble writing poetry in the last year and a half. Find it difficult to, sing about the dark times in the dark times. Part of that may be a kind of pressure, maybe a more acute pressure that I've felt to write specifically about current events, which sometimes felt when I've been trying to write poetry that it was overly determined by, I guess Wallace Stevens talks about the pressure of the real over the imagination. So I've actually, oddly enough, I've been writing prose for the last several months, mostly writing essays and memoirish things. I guess in the absence of a real social life, I've had a lot of time to relive the past and been living in the past, I think, more than usual. And the essays has been a nice form to explore that. I will say, though, that poetry is never that far away. I mean, I think within the essay, I'm always thinking about the great ways in which poetry moves, and moves associatively, or even the rhythms of the sentence are still there. So poetry's present. It's just perhaps been for me hibernating. But I would love to hear about your experiences. And I thought, Mairéad, if you would take it from here.
Thanks, Will. My experience is probably not that dissimilar from yours. I think almost probably 100%, close to 100% of the finished poems that I wrote last year were in January and February. And at that time, like I do, at that time, like I actually am kind of hyper aware of the news. And at that time in January was Brexit. That was kind of all consuming. And then also something I was writing about was the shooting down of the Ukrainian passenger plane by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards at the beginning of January. And like they were the two things that were, especially the latter, that were galvanizing me. And then from March on, because I have a very heavy teaching load, it just became, it mushroomed then, and it totally dominated the rest of the year. And one sort of standing thing that I do every year is I participate in the Boston Poetry Marathon. So I always have new work for the Boston Poetry Marathon, but I didn't want to read anything that I wrote pre-pandemic. So I just was looking at it this morning because I have so little work from last year, but basically I presented, it was a rant against the USPS, the US Post Office, Postal Service. And it basically was a whole debacle that I ranted about, but it was primarily objects I saw on the ground on my way to walking to the post office to rant at them, and so it was a slideshow, so, and I was looking at it this morning and I was thinking how strange it was, like that and the objects were like mostly dead animals, cigarette butts, beer cans, all sorts of little liquor things, masks, just like what you'd expect in an American inner city, but when I was looking at it this morning, I was thinking it's interesting, the text element of that piece was completely stripped away from the image, and it was the image that dominated. It was almost. And the last thing I'll say about last year, like I did have a good time with sort of ideas, so I did. Ideas went into the books all the time, but not finished work. But I did, like you, think about writing a lot. And I actually found politically, in a way, not on a broader scale, but maybe on a more institutional scale, that the chat function of webinars or Zoom was enormously useful. The sort of writing that you could do in the chat that you wouldn't normally be able to do in an institutional meeting. And also, I was really very aware of the difference between my students speaking and how they would speak and how they would write in the chat. And it was like, I kind of, in a way, like, I think a lot of us came to things again and new from the outside. And like writing, it just seemed such a stable, evolved thing, compared to the hesitation of speech, particularly on Zoom, because it has to be cued, while writing is almost subversive if you want it to be. So they were my thoughts on last year. So I also am very keen to hear what John and Dirceu have to say.
Great, thanks, Mairéad. Yeah.
Well, I came across this book recently. It's a small collection of essays by Zadie Smith called Intimations. I'm not sure if you know the book, but it's a series of short essays that were written during the pandemic. And it was a way that she was processing what life was like here in New York City, and also in her home of London during the time. And I think I was doing something like that, just less successfully and less articulately. in my little notebook. Same thing, writing thoughts down. Um, it was hard to really generate any real work, but one thing the pandemic did do for me was to help me recommit to the discipline. And I think in part it might have been a way for me to find a safe space. I would come down here. I'm in my basement, actually, in my home. My desk is here, my books are here, and this is where I would come and really, really shelter within a shelter. Um, a few years ago, when I was in Italy, actually, went to Pompeii, and our guide was walking us through, and we came across this bakery. And I remember him telling us a story of this baker who had um, formed some dough, slid it into the oven, and fully expected to live long enough to see bread come back. But he didn't. He died. Right, the sky came falling down, and that was it. And early on, my wife, I remember during the pandemic, kept asking this question: Is this how we end? Yeah, none of us knew. We'd never seen anything like this before in our lifetime. We didn't know, and it made me think. If I end today or this week, right,
Mm.
what do I want to be doing? Spooning, right? I want to be spooning my wife first and foremost. But if not that, I don't want to be here, just like the baker was at work. Yeah.
Mm.
So I made sure that whenever I could, I'd be down here working, and but I wasn't really able to concentrate. So the work for me really was kind of going through the motions. But I had a
Mm.
spell, for instance, for about a few months where I was getting up at 5:30 in the morning, coming down because I wanted to have my butt in the chair by 6, and was writing before the day started. Didn't turn out anything worth holding on to, but something about the discipline and the regularity of it, the routine of it, gave me some solace. And I hope that'll carry through even after, right, when things start to open up and you have other options. Uh, but yeah, it just kind of caused me to double down and really commit to this thing that we do.
Mm. Mm.
That's very
Interesting.
chatty.
Yeah.
Dirceu, how about you?
Well, first of all, hi to everyone. It's very, very nice to be invited here to join all of you. It's a great pleasure and see uh, people that I like so much. It's great opportunity. On the thing of the pandemic, I'd like to say that in Brazil, we have, on top of that, we have a fascist government. Um, so it's kind of looming there. All these very very nasty, horrible things that you have to daily deal with. And I think my writing got a little more maniacal than it usually is. So I
Mhm.
think my poems, in a certain way, they translate this very tense environment because it's not only the as John has said that this event that is completely unbelievable happening to the whole world, you know, but also this particular thing because we had like I think the most giant protest against the president last week,
Yeah.
and the police came down the protesters with such violence that is remarkable. And I've seen things that it's really shocking. From my window, just right there, I can sometimes hear the police on horses. And one of the poems that I have written is because of this looming presence of violence everywhere, and
Mm.
the horses walking there for me was something, that had a little bit of it. And the poem I've written is, I think, interesting in the sense that at that moment I recalled all those battles of the past and Homer and everything, because there is such a violence. And for me, it was something that Achilles decided to do. He decided honor through violence. Yeah. And I think that that's why Ovid hated Achilles. And I think that in a sense I got this impression, and the poem is more or less like that. But the whole thing is, um, even in Brazil, the pandemic is just horrible because the government is not doing anything to, you know, speed up the vaccination of the population. So it's really tough. But I think my writing got, as I said, maniacal, or more maniacal than it was.
Right.
And I think the images are a little more brute images. But I think that just like John said, the thing of keeping a kind of a discipline and doing things. I translated many poems this year. It was kind of shocking. I wasn't on this thing of translating. I was just teaching translation. But it's really something that got a very strong thing going. The translation thing,
Yeah.
or even the writing about this.
Yeah, I've been Dirceu translating quite a lot myself. I mean, and that has been keeping the poetry muscle going, and it's lovely to be in the company. I mean, feel close to the another consciousness. You know, that act of reading very closely when you're translating as well has been great company. I could go on with you all just like this for the rest of the time, but I think I would like to
John.
jump to John, and then we'll come back to Dirceu and Mairéad. So if we could split the screen, thank you. Okay. Oh, all right. Hey, John.
Hey, man.
The two beards.
That's it.
I'm trying.
It's like that though, man. Last time I saw you, you didn't have that.
No, it's clean cut before. So I thought what I would do is ask you to read a poem to start. It would be nice. We've been talking a little bit about poetry, so and it would be great to hear some. I believe we settled on the poem, Dear Yusuf. Is that?
Yes.
All right. The only thing I might ask you before you read the poem, I wonder, well, if you feel comfortable doing this, since we have an international audience. I think I know who Yusuf is, but I'm not sure if others might. So if you want to mention who Yusuf is, and then I'd love to hear the poem.
Absolutely. This poem is dedicated to the poet Yusuf Komunyakaa, who is an American poet, Pulitzer Prize winning poet, who was also a teacher of mine and has come to be over the years a mentor and a friend. And when I lost another mentor of mine, the poet Philip Levine, I started this project where I wanted to write poems dedicated to friends, mentors, teachers who are important to me, who are still here. You know, I wanted to give people their flowers while they were still alive. This poem is actually the only one that was publishable by the time the book went to press. I have some others that are still in the works. So when I wrote this poem, if you don't know Yusuf Komunyaka's work, check him out. You might see some similarities in tone, diction. Right? So in these poems, what I'm trying to do is be in conversation with the particular poet in a language that they would understand. So often the language mirrors the type of language and some of the tropes that they would use in their own poems. So this is for Yusuf Komunyakaa, and it's called Dear Yusuf. Again, last night, I caught Medusa sitting in my living room. Not the devil, not the dog in the shadows made of shadows, not the old translucent maroon sharpening his machete, but Medusa, lighting a spliff, spreading tarot cards across the floor. I didn't startle when a door slammed, but half expected a black cat to run over my shoes. She wore the same red lipstick as the night before, Yusuf. Same black teddy with the skinny strap slipped from her shoulder. Singing to herself, her voice split in two, contralto, baritone, balladeer stroking the braids of a woman everyone knows he beats, the woman singing yes, and it's all right, sequined sleeves hiding every track, a disco ball scattering shards of light along some drab and peeling wall. Medusa cut the deck, relit the spliff, flipped one card, then another, took a pull so long I thought she'd catch fire. You've not always been a good man, she said, showing 7 cards, coughing hard. There was something she wasn't telling me. She liked that I didn't ask, liked how I watched her dusting ashes from her thigh. I see trouble finds you easy, hey boy? I pulled her onto my lap, or I slid myself somehow up under her. I can't remember which. She singing yes, and it's all right. Then, slipping the joint fireside first between her lips, she took my face in her hands and shotgunned a cloud into my open mouth. Some nights, Yusuf, the serpents curse my name. Some nights, they tell me secrets.
Lovely poem and beautiful poem. Thank you. Thank you. I think I'm going to, I have lots of questions for you, John. I mean, I love the book, as you know, and have taught it. But I wanted to, I might change the order of some of these questions, but I wanted to, because you're just bringing up writing, being in conversation with other poets, certainly other poets, other traditions. But I wanted to ask you about one of the great achievements of your poems, I find, is immediacy and intimacy. There are poems in which I feel like Galway Canal said I could hear the human in them. Your reader feels spoken to, and sometimes this comes in the form of indecisiveness, which is also Yusuf Komunyakaa quality in some poems. Sometimes it's in the form of direct address. Here you're speaking specifically to a person, addressing a particular you. In a lot of your poems, you turn to the reader and speak directly to them. And almost always some of that intimacy is achieved by the clarity of your language. So I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how those qualities, intimacy, voice, clarity, are important to you, both as a writer and a reader.
Sure. I'll start as a reader. You know, the poems that draw me in most are the poems where I do feel like I'm being spoken to. Yeah. Where the poet seems to care that there's a person there listening. You know, and I think given this conversation we've been having about the pandemic, I think going forward, that's even going to be more of my aesthetic, right? You know, for a lot of us during this pandemic, reading was a way that we found company. Yeah. For me, poetry has been that over the years. It's been a place where I can find, I don't know, connection with an other, right? And this could be an other that lives on the other side of the globe, or that lived 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, right? There's something about poetry, I think, that allows a speaker to transcend time and space. So my hope with a lot of these poems is that, you know, I'm doing that for someone else. Yeah. I enjoy reading many different kinds of poems, and I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with the detached voice or the voice that the depersonalized poem. But I think for me, it is important to connect to another. I was talking to some students recently about the difference between, no, sorry, it was in an interview. Someone was asking me about the audience, and I said to them, I don't really think of the audience so much as a listener, right? The audience is kind of an abstraction, just a sea of nameless faces. But I think in terms of a listener, right? If I'm writing, I'm communicating to one person listening, yeah, and that helps me focus. The clarity you talk about is a way for me to do that, and a lot of it has to do with a lot of my early influences. I mentioned Yusuf, Philip Levine, Sharon Olds, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Larry Levis is someone who has a lot of digressions and asides in his poems.
Right.
Yeah.
There's another aspect that about a lot of your poetry as well. I feel that that memory, as I mentioned before, it seems to be alive and well in your poems. It's certainly a subject of many of the poems, not necessarily your Yusuf, but and sometimes appears to be the source of them. I've got to be careful here about how to wording this question, because but many seem for me too intensely felt to be entirely made up, and I wonder if you could talk about also fashioning poems out of experience, and whether you see also poetry as a place for personal disclosure, or memory as a well to draw from.
Yeah, absolutely. As a source, yes, I think we do ourselves a great disservice when we cut ourselves off from a whole life lived. Yeah, experiences, memories, traumas, joys. Yeah. In my poems, though, I think even the poems that are somewhat autobiographical, or at least quasi-autobiographical, there's always some fictionalization happening, right? And I realized that in my first book, where in order to write the most compelling poem, often I change perspectives and tell the story from the point of view, for instance, of an assailant rather than the victim of a violence, let's say. And the speaker in a poem at that point is no longer me, the author, right? But it makes for a more interesting poem, more interesting read. And when I became more aware of that, I also started to think of the way that we construct self over time. Yeah. So even our own, those things that we consider memories, the memories change over time, right? So what that means is the narrative changed. The events don't change. The events were what they were, but our interpretation of them over the years changes. Yeah. Our experience changes us and changes how we filter that experience. So even when the poems are definitely grounded in some kind of memory, there's always a fictionalization. Sure. So one of the things I was really interested in exploring in this book were the ways that memory, right, actually shapes ourself instead of our self-shaping memory.
Yeah.
And how the stories we tell about ourselves are a way to create ourselves. So even the autobiographical poems, at best, are only quasi-autobiographical. There's always some lying going on somewhere.
Sure.
I lean into that. I lean into it.
Yeah, good. That's good. Oh, John, man, I could talk to you and listen to you forever. I'm worried we're running low on time, so I'm gonna switch to Mairéad and Dirceu, but we'll come back in for the last minutes. I think we're gonna go over a little bit. I think that's fine. Don't you two don't feel rushed. Okay.
Yeah. No, it certainly is good to have this experiment, and to listen. And this forum is not great for spontaneity, but we'll see what we can do with it at the end. So I think I'd like to follow your lead, Will, by asking Dirceu to read first, if there's something you would like to read, and I will not be short of questions.
So, would you like me to read first in Portuguese? I have a very short poem.
Please, please. Yes.
So I'll read from my book of last year, Coraça, that Will told us about. It's a short poem. In Portuguese, it's called Ontem. Ontem. As pessoas de ontem nunca nasceram. Nunca é dia ontem. Ontem é uma vala, um depósito, armazém de ferragens. As pessoas de ontem comem sorrindo um sorriso de animais com dor. Ontem tem digestão de fotos, de famílias, de amarelo e de amassado. Ontem jamais foi o passado. Ontem houve como um sonho contado em um pesadelo, e as pessoas de ontem viajam à noite na mais densa neblina, todas surdas aos nossos gritos. Ontem é um abismo onde pés deslizam e os rostos vão cobertos de macau de cegar ao sol. Quem quer ontem hoje? E quem será amanhã, se não perdido no limiar do não? Now in English. Yesterday people were never born. It's not day in yesterday, it's a ditch, a storeroom, a hardware depot. Yesterday people eat smiling, a smile of animals in pain. Yesterday has the indigestion of photos, families, of yellow and yearning. Yesterday was never the past. Yesterday happened like a dream told in a nightmare. And yesterday people travel at night in the thickest of fogs, all of them deaf to our yells. Yesterday is an abyss where feet slide and faces go covered in lime so as to blind us under the sun. Who wants yesterday now? And who will be tomorrow if not lost in the confines of no?
Thanks, Dirceu. Do you want to read another poem, or will we go ahead and talk?
Well, let's talk a little bit.
Well, my question, it's not to do with, it's not being spun out of the poem, but it is kind of to do with yesterday and today. And it's a very minor question. Like, it's not a central question. For me, to talk to you, the central questions would be political, okay? And also to do with poetry. They would be the central questions. So this is not a central question, although translation also, but it's something that I often wondered about, and it's to do with academic training. You know, that your academic training, your PhD was written in Portuguese, right? The thesis was written in Portuguese, but the specialization was 15th century Italian poetry and 16th century English poetry. And I suppose my question is, I'm not exactly sure how to word it, but I know, say myself, I'm Irish, and I did my postgraduate work in America because I couldn't do the equivalent in Ireland. And, sometimes I have been a bit shocked in the past, like in my school, that there would be an assumption that because I'm a poet and because I'm Irish, I should teach Irish poetry. But I don't actually have really much education formally in Irish poetry, so that my education is in English poetry and American poetry, but I suppose it's to do with how you're perceived. And my question probably is something to do with national identity and academic training. And is there a tension? Is there a tension there that you are Brazilian, you're a Brazilian poet, you write in Portuguese, but your academic training is in European Renaissance literature? And I'm just wondering what that construction is for you. Is it tense? Is it ideal? Has it had an impact on your career? In how you present yourself outside Brazil and how you present yourself inside Brazil?
Well, that's a good question. I think maybe it makes me a little bit strange in my own country. I think I have heard that from friends and everything, but Brazil has had like a kind of uh, proximity in the past with French culture. When people were uh, studying college, they would address themselves to French culture. My father, for instance, who was a very, very um, French-oriented kind of, of person. And the fact that I went for Italian and English traditions is a bit, I guess, weird. And but for me, it's just poetry. I can't really think in terms of nations in this sense. I have very, very much a great admiration for um, the adventure of language.
Right.
So when I'm reading like in French or Italian or in English, or even when I'm thinking in different times, like you said, the 15th century or 16th century, it's not I have to be historical about the whole thing, of course, if I'm writing about it, but especially academic writing. But the thing for me is that I feel it close. I do not feel it like it was something different. I tell my students, the translation students, I say, because I teach translation of poetry, I tell them that they're not translating actually from language to language. Their translation, the translation is from poetry to poetry. It's the
Right.
same language in a certain
Right.
sense. So that's the whole thing, but it kind of make you a little bit strange in your own place, and certainly you're a stranger elsewhere, and then
Yeah.
a
Because
poet's a stranger, I think.
yeah, but it's like it's one of the surprising things about life as you go on. You realize like how things really are in boxes a lot, and if you don't actually fit the box, it's to your disadvantage. But I wanted to ask you also. I mean, I've loads of questions, but I can only ask a couple. But I wanted to ask you if you could talk about the Cocteau project, Langer to Bees, that is in print. It's being printed now. Is that the case? The
Well,
translation?
I'm not really sure. I was told that this would be the case, but it was a friend of mine who asked me if I had anything to contribute uh, to a book they were about to publish of homoerotic poetry. And I had this poem that I love very much by Jean Cocteau, L'Ange Abuse, which is a very, very intricate poem, and it's really, really difficult to translate it. And I really loved the opportunity to do it because it, it, it it was like I was waiting for someone to make the invitation to dedicate a little bit of myself to Jean Cocteau's poetry, and that's I think is a great poem. There is a translation to Portuguese by the very great poet, Portuguese poet Herberto Helder, but it's a translation in which Helder brought the poem, Jean Cocteau's poem, closer to himself. It's a kind of a very, very inventive version, I would say. And I tried
Okay,
to stay closer to the mechanisms that I found in the original poem in French.
brilliant. And the last question I'm going to ask, because I'm thinking about time as well, is to do with Brig Flats. Like I couldn't believe it that you were translating Brig Flats and Basil Bunting. I think it's the most audacious thing, but probably everything you do is audacious actually. So what is the status of that?
Well, there was a year after I've been to Norwich. with a translation residency there, dedicated to bunting. But a year after that, was 2015 that I was there. A year after that, a Brazilian translator published here, 2016, published here a translation of Brick Flats, complete translation. It's totally different from mine, but it kind of
Okay,
put
okay.
a name to the whole thing. But I have the poem. It's completed now, so I really loved to do this. And the fact is that Portuguese is not, as I told you, we have had a conversation about bunting when I was there in
Siena.
Siena. Yeah. And the thing is that bunting has this very Anglo-Saxon kind of makeup to his poem, and Portuguese language, especially I would say, especially Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, is the opposite, because it's really soft and sweet, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole thing was to try to make my language a little bit rockier and just like bunting's. So it was really exhilarating to do it. It's so difficult, I'd say, but really, really amazing.
Well, on our way back to Will, who's going to wind up, is there anything you'd like to say, Dirceu?
Not right now. No, good questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, then you can call Will back to the room. Will, come back. Thank you. So, Will, there you go. You know, like
I was muted. Yeah.
There's so much more to say, that if we were actually sitting around a table, you know, and had a glass of wine or a cup of coffee, you know, you could, like this, like with last year, you know, the other like amazing energies in the United States. Well, one was anxiety over the presidential election, but the other one was you know, hitting the streets after the murder of George Floyd, and how that, and you know, it's probably totally inappropriate and wrong, but when we were speaking earlier, I was thinking that was the closest thing to poetry in some ways. And it's not even at all like poetry, but it was the closest thing to an extraordinariness that was unexpected in a way, you know, not murder that is expected, unfortunately, but the unity of the response, you know, that was unexpected. And also because we were living in kind of in fear, like everyone was living in fear. And then the fear just like nobody, I mean, there's people were living in a different kind of fear, but in terms of the pandemic, it did not affect our actions, you know, which was, I thought that was an amazing thing. Anyway, you know, and there's so much to be said about Brazil right now as well. Is the football game going to happen, Dirceu? The football thing.
I think
so.
Copa America. Yeah, I think so. You know, there are two very great traditions in Brazil. One is football, and the other is a coup d'état. This is the two arts we have perfected to a T. It's just marvelous, you know. So I think it's going to happen. Some people are trying to avoid it, but rational people speaking now in Brazil are very few. So.
Yeah. It's weird because time has been so different in this last year, but something like the Copa thing, like it's like a big event like that can suddenly be landed in a country in a few days, you know. So that things happen both like really, really slowly and weirdly during this time, but they also can happen very fast, and it's quite shocking. And decisions are generally not in the hands of people at large.
Yeah. I'm afraid I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. I think we're probably going to have to cut this short. But I just want to thank everybody, Dirceu and John in particular, for your poems and your wonderful answers to all the questions, and of course to you, Mairéad, for being my partner in this venture.
Could we end with a poem? Could we end with a short poem?
Should we?
Each of from John and Dirceu.
Yeah, if that's okay with.
If you're willing.
I'm willing. Maybe just say you go first while I try to find a poem. You know, I like long poems.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
You're muted. You're muted, Dirceu.
I think he's still looking. Yeah.
I'm just looking here. Oh, there's one. I'll just read it in English, right?
Okay.
It's a poem I have written in 2010 because I was very shocked to see people in Paris, of all cities, walking and saying with placards and everything that they were against people of the same sex um, um, raising a child. That was horrifying for me because the tradition of libertines in the 18th century, and then you have, modernism happening in Paris, and then Paris 1968, and then all of a sudden the city is stormed by this kind of people. And so occurred me this poem. It's called, after Baudelaire, it's called Courage de Luxe. The same God who gave thee thy canned laws, mummy, daddy, he gave thee queens, faggots, dykes. He gave thee computers and the plagues of Egypt. He gave thee hands and feet and a perfect body, or gave thee a series of defects in thy metaphysics and thy body. The same God will give thee back to ashes, who gave thee the bomb in the blooming dreams of Oppenheimer's sin, and who gave thee the key for the doors and the metaphors, the God who gave himself the name chance, or gave himself all the images, or even the full void of a soundless explosion at the center of the universe, the God who gave thee thy crass stupidity that crawls from thy mind like the arms of orangutan. He gave thee Paris for thee to spawn a pig to whom he gave the Phrygian cap and Frigibarjo, the very same God, only one and many, of only one name and many, who gave thee fatherland, army, hippies, deserters, the stock exchange and the toys of science, poets, and Plato. He to whom occurred giving thee a religion so that thou wouldst play God. He gave thee pure crystalline water and pollution, sweet vain romantic hope, a prick, a cunt. Or gave thee both and set thee albino as a god in a triclinium, the God that gave thee desire and depression, the intellect, hands clasped in a prayer, the sublimation he gave thee, giving thee fucking or thinking as an option. The same God who gave himself a name of a primeval woman, Gaia, the gay one. This God who gave thee the sex of angels as a play of dices that he played and still does when giving thee doubt. The God who received Empedocles in the hottest hole of earth, plunging with the courage of fucking mountains, and the God who gave Christ as a gift to the cross, he who gave thee this image and likeness, it's worth remembering. God likes giving.
Thank you, Dirceu.
Yeah, that was beautiful. So I found a short poem, but it wasn't my own. So I want to read a poem by Robert Hayden.
Okay.
Mairéad, when you were talking about the protests that were happening globally after the George Floyd murder, I agree. That was the closest thing we had to poetry in many ways. And one thing that it did for me, it gave me a glimmer of hope at a time when little else did. Yeah. So I want to read this sonnet by Robert Hayden that I kept coming back to over and over this year, dedicated to the abolitionist, ex-slave Frederick Douglass.
Oh my God.
Yeah, because I think that speaks to a lot of the energy that was in the air this year and this past year, and it's still in the air. When it is finally ours, this freedom, this liberty, this beautiful and terrible thing, needful to man as air, usable as earth, when it belongs at last to all, when it is truly instinct, brain matter, diastole, systole, reflex action, when it is finally one, when it is more than the gaudy mumbo jumbo of politicians, this man, this Douglass, this former slave, this Negro beaten to his knees, exiled, visioning a world where none is lonely, none hunted, alien, this man, superb in love and logic, this man shall be remembered. Oh, not with statues' rhetoric, not with legends and poems and wreaths of bronze alone, but with the lives grown out of his life, the lives fleshing his dream of the beautiful, needful thing.
John, that's the biggest sonnet I've ever heard. It's like there's a huge poem inside it. It's like it seems monumental.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah.
Long lines.
There's so many turns, and like you said, there's so many asides and digressions in it. Yeah. My hope is that people listening will forget who wrote what, and when they go back and they'll say, "Oh yeah, I remember that poem that
I think there's great consolation in the good work that has been done, you know. So I think I'd almost prefer to have that than to be doing it myself, you know, like to have that work and to know that people did that work, and sometimes it's kind of good that they're dead though, you know, because I often think that I wouldn't get on with them, or they wouldn't like me, you know, or they wouldn't speak to a woman or something, you know.
Well, I think that's with a laugh and a wonderful poem, wonderful poems from you all. I think that would be a good note to go out on. I just want to thank Dirceu again and John for joining us, and Mairéad, as always. It's a pleasure to be in your company. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Thank you very much, Will. And this was an interesting conversation. I'm going to look at it online again, you know, because I'd like to unpack it more and hear everything again. And I hope people who are listening will as well. And you know, maybe somebody will be looking at this in 6 months' time, hopefully.
Thank you all very much. It was a great pleasure, really.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Will.
Thank you all.